Good morning, folks. Welcome to those folks online. We're just going to take a couple minutes to let people kind of wander in. We had a little bit of a interrupted this morning with the Great Shakeout, which went nice and smoothly. So if you are joining us online and you would like to participate via Pear Deck, the code is up there. There's also option of using the chat, whatever you're most comfortable with. Same thing for my folks in the room. If you are comfortable, if you want to use Pear Deck, you'll also get a copy of your notes and all the things sent to you at the end. So that's another way of participating. And in the meantime, we're just going to hang tight for probably about 2 more minutes, and then we'll get started. Just want to put your name in the chat, say hello to the other participants who are there. And that way I can say hello to you too. Go ahead, get started. Welcome to Equity, Anti-Racism, Social Justice, Oh My. It originally said science because I'm the science coordinator here at the Santa Clara County Office of Ed. And that's where I predominantly put my focus, but hi there. That's who I am. I want to start with a land acknowledgement, and that we acknowledge that the Santa Clara County and our schools occupy the unceded territory of the Muwekma Ohlone Nation, the sovereign nation and original people of the skies, lands, and waters where we work and learn. The Muwekma Ohlone people are the stewards of these lands and of the teaching and the learning that comes from and responds to the needs of the land and people who share it. May our daily lives and work, research, teaching, and community engagement support the evolving vision of the Muwekma Ohlone for their communities and lands. So in looking at the land acknowledgement, there's a heaviness and gravity to this, right? Right off the bat, it starts with unceded territory. And that these lands were taken from people who were here, from our indigenous community members. And they're still here, and recognizing that. It was interesting over the weekend. I was down in Palm Springs presenting at the California Association of Science Educators Conference. And I learned that the conference center itself is actually seated on the Cahuilla Indian land. So the tribe owns the land that the convention center's on, a couple casinos, a couple hotels, but the rest of it had been dispersed. So that was interesting to learn. As we engage today, I want to keep students at the center of our work. That's why we're here, that's why we're in education. Be present, be curious, be open. Name your needs. So if you want to sit on a topic a little bit longer, we can do that. I have a presentation prepared, but if we need to, veer away, oh my word. The TV has been turning off on me. There we go. I don't know why. That's now the second time it's done that. But going back to the community agreements, name your needs, make space, take space. So be aware of the level of your voice within the room. Experience discomfort. It's always a little awkward, a little uncomfortable talking about race, identity, racism. There's a lot of emotion that sits behind that. Recognize those emotions when they surface, because it can be, it can feel really heavy. Honor and hold confidentiality. So what's said here stays here, but the learning leaves. And then together we know a lot. I am not an expert on this. I am still learning. I'm still on my equity journey. And I still feel like I have plenty to learn, even though I am up here as a white educator talking about this. So we've already had a little bit of time, but again, if you want to, if you haven't had a moment to pull up the things you want to pull up on your phone or on your device, give about a minute to get yourselves settled in and ready to go. I'll just wait till it gets to about a minute because they might want to pull up PDFs and things like that. There's lots of resources in the session document that you can access and use in whatever context you're in. This time to kind of settle into the space and take that deep breath is a UDL structure, and it's something that I've started incorporating into my presentations, both in person and virtually, because sometimes we come flying in from things. We're like wrapped up in like conversations that we just had, and we just need that moment of pause. And, you know, sometimes restart the TV. Okay, welcome to our 5 people online. The slide decks and the information that you can find, you can join via Pear Deck. The joinpd.com PGFZLV is the Pear Deck code. You can also access the materials via the bit.ly link, which is bit.ly/ICSC22 equity. No dots in between, it's just all one. So welcome. All right, so for today, our intended impact is to build a common understanding of equity, anti-racism, and social justice, examine the conditions of an anti-racist classroom, and then begin to unpack how the isms and bias show up in our classrooms or up in our context. So with that in mind, just take a moment to either in, somewhere, write it down, jot it down, write a goal for yourself for today's session. Give you about a minute to consider that. If you have a handout and you want to write it on the handout, or if you have a note taker that you're using, jot it down there. Hey, son. The TV just keeps shutting off. So I don't know what that's about. No? The HDMI connection. So we need to give it some love and some support. All right. So our journey for today, we'll talk a little bit about equity, anti-racism, and social justice. We'll then look at the conditions of the anti-racist classroom, and then we'll start to develop that critical lens of how bias and ism show up in education. But before that, I want you to take a moment to find somebody in here, make a new friend. If you know the person that you're sitting with, I encourage you to make a new friend with somebody else. But we're going to hear from a group of students first about the power of names.
My name, identity.
My name, my identity.
My name, my identity.
My name is Cynthia Belina Hernandez, and my mother gave me that name because she wanted to name me Cynthia, like a princess, but she decided to split it into 2, so now it's Cynthia Belina Hernandez.
My name is Manbir, and today I found out that my name means I care about people.
My English name is Al. My parents gave me the name Tui, which means Jade River, because it was supposed to give me good fortune, and I guess it kind of does.
My name is Angel Gustavo Silva Moreno. Angel means messenger of 2 last names come from Spain.
Jerry is my name, write it like it's fame. Never been ashamed about how I got my name. My mom says it's my shine. love it till I die.
What is your name story?
What is your name story?
What's your name story?
What is your name story?
What is your name story?
I want you to find somebody, say hello, introduce yourself, and share one of the following, either your name story, a fun fact about your name, different names you go by, or things that you like best about your name. And then share about what calls you to equity work. And then one of the tools or skills you're hoping to develop out of today. So my folks online, feel free to drop it in the chat. So a little bit, for example, hi, I'm Tara Sikorski, Science Coordinator here at Santa Clara County Office of Ed. Fun fact is that you can tell when people met me by what name they call me. If they pronounce it Tara, they know me prior to moving out to California. If they call me Tara, it's been since I've moved out here. So all my California friends and everybody I've met here in California all call me Tara. But all my East Coast friends, all the friends I met in college, my family members all call me Tara. Why the change? I got tired of being associated with Gone with the Wind, The Plantation, and the Antebellum South. Because everyone would be like, oh, Tara, like Gone with the Wind. No. So that's why I go by Tara now. What calls me to this work? Personal experiences, things I've seen in classrooms, things I've heard from students, things I've experienced myself as a white female, which seems kind of odd, but it's true. And then I'm always just trying to learn more. How can I do better? How can I reach more educators? How can I support educators in this journey? So I'll give you about 2 minutes. Find somebody in the room or my folks online, drop it in the chat. Your name, a little bit about your name story, and for my folks online, maybe just like what calls you to the equity work. And if you have a little bit of space, some of the skills. All right, 2 minutes. Make a new friend, or return to your spaces. In listening into some of the conversation in the room, I actually just learned a little bit more backstory on this, the My Name, My Identity project, and why this happened. Wyatt, can I get you to share a little bit about that?
So when we were designing these modules for the My Name, My Identity project, some of the students from Eastside San Jose had voiced their concerns about their names having been mispronounced or in some cases actually never spoken by their teachers. So one student shared with us that she was brought up for truancy despite the fact that she had been at school every day on time because she didn't recognize her name when roll was called. Another student explained that her maestra was too afraid to try and say her name, so she never got called on for an entire year, never got to engage in the conversation with her maestra. So this is what turned into this passion project. It was all student voice driven. So please download it. I hope you can enjoy it.
Thank you for sharing that, Wyatt. Yeah, names are hugely important. And, I've heard stories of adults reclaiming their name and the correct pronunciations of their name. And, working with others to ensure that their names are being pronounced correctly. This was brought up earlier. This is one of my favorite ways to start off conversations about equity, racism, and social justice, is that invitation to a brave space. And that, by Mickey Scott B. Jones, and that's the together we will create a brave space because there is no such thing as a safe space. We exist in the real world, we all carry scars, and we have all caused wounds. In this space, we seek to turn down the volume of the outside world, amplify voices that fight to be heard elsewhere, and we call each other to more truth and love. Yeah. We have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. We have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. We will not be perfect. It will not always be what we wish it to be, but It will be our brave space together, and we will work on it side by side. I love this one. Yeah, it's having a space for people to speak their truths, talk about their lived experience, and be surrounded in love as that happens. And to participate in a brave space, it takes courage. And I want to recognize that. So that leads us to our courageous conversations. This is the Courageous Conversation Compass by Glenn Singleton. And I love this because it helps, I'm a visual person, and it helps me start to identify where I'm entering into conversations, particularly challenging conversations, conversations that encourage bravery and compassion. And so I can I have it right here with me all the time. Sometimes I check myself, like, where am I on this wheel? And where do I need to be in order to respond in this conversation? So we've got intellectual, the thinking, the head, the relational, that acting, the hands and feet, like getting in there. The emotional, the feeling, right? And it's not always happy, feel-good feelings of love and warmth. But it's in our heart, and usually when it's not so happy and warm, it punches us to our gut, right? There's that queasy sensation, that not so good feeling, punch to the gut. And then our moral, our believing what's in our soul. So right now I want my folks online, there is an option to respond in Pear Deck, but my folks in the room, there are actually 4 posters up: intellectual, relational, emotional, more, and believing. And I want to see just where people are and how they're entering into that conversation today. So think about where you're at, and then go on up, stand on up, and go ahead, go to your poster. So sometimes we're like in between things, right? And that, that relational and emotional, sometimes that span there, the intellectual and relational. But check in with your partner real quick. Why did you choose that one? Either intellectual, relational, emotional, or moral. Just quick check in with a partner. My folks participating online, we've got an intellectual. If you feel comfortable dropping it in the chat, feel free to drop it in the chat. All right, about 10 more seconds. And if you've finished up your conversation with your partner, feel free to go ahead, head back to your seat. This is the flow. We're going to kick it off with that. Just a quick, there's Post-it notes on your table. I love these. These are full sticky. So instead of it just being like a little top edge of stickiness, this is the reverse, where it's almost a full thing of stickiness and then just a little bit to grab it. These were life-changing in the classroom, especially if you love using Post-it notes with students, because then these don't fall down. So on your Post-it note, just jot down, or in the chat, how would you define equity? What pops into your brain when you hear the word equity? All right, give you about 10 seconds to finish up your thought, finish up your idea. My folks in the chat, if you're still putting it in the chat, there's a little bit of a time delay between what I'm saying here and when you all receive it. So if you still want to add your thoughts or ideas to the chat, please feel free. All right, so we got 1. We got 2. Okay, so we've got access to the same ideas or services. Are there anyone who has similar definitions of equity in here? Okay. And then the other one from the chat, equity is a value. Or equity is value. Some other ideas.
All right, each and every student has a voice and the opportunity to learn and grow.
All right, anybody else here have something similar?
Each and every student or person present has a voice and is seen for who they want to be seen and respected for their experience.
Okay, so similar, but adding that idea of respect for their experiences. So taking into account their background. Yeah.
I said delivering to the individual based on their needs, meeting where they're at with that classic fence drawing. That just always is in my head.
So people think of the fence drawing and meeting people where they're at. And Wyatt, I know Wyatt's writing. Right, Wyatt writes her heart out.
I'm just basically saying where the academic and social emotional outcomes of our learners cannot be determined by predictable patterns that are based on race, class, gender, other identities. We disrupt that.
Yeah. So it's interesting because some people went with equity and other people just jumped right to equity in education. And that it's sometimes hard to separate our work identity from everything else and what we do. And again, this is a room of educators. We hold on to that educator identity really hard. So most people think about that box drawing. That box representation has always bothered me. And then I read this blog called Fakequity, and they're all about pointing out people who do the talk, but don't actually walk the walk, right? They talk equity, blah, 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 blah. But then when you look at the actions and the words don't align. And they had this great, there's 2 blog posts about not using that box graphic. I think part of why I like this one is because it talks about food, and I love food. Also, it resonates with me because I have food sensitivities. So equality is everyone receives the same sandwich, everyone receives an equal portion, and the sandwich maker has control and power over what's in that sandwich with no differentiation. Thinking about yesterday's lunch, there was boxed lunches of sandwiches. People had choice, but when I walked up, being gluten-free and really gluten intolerant, triggers migraines for me. I walked up and I was like, oh no, I suddenly can't have any lunch. And I'm gonna have to scramble to think of something else to do. But fortunately, they took my needs into account, and there was a gluten-free sandwich box waiting for me, which was really exciting. Whereas equity is people have what they need to eat a meaningful meal to feel whole. And multiple strategies are used. Not every meal is the same. And we support the people to make their own meal and accommodates for needs. I'm thinking about some of my students. I taught freshmen for a while, and I had this adorable freshman, and he was 6'5" as a freshman, already starting to have a build, Samoan heritage. And he would show up with a cooler every day of food because what the cafeteria was serving was by no means going to meet his nutritional needs that day. So in education, these are 3 common definitions of equity in education. Each child receives what they need to develop their full and academic potential. Equity is fair outcomes, treatment, and opportunities with the aim of ensuring all students are able to learn and thrive. And then the last one is educational equity means that there's no predictability of success or failure that correlates with any social or cultural factor. Can everyone in here find a favorite? Something that resonates with them? More than others. And there's nuanced differences between these. And sometimes there's a need to like take all of them and meld them together, right? And these come from 3 different sources, the center being from our California Department of Education. So real quick, instead of doing a quick write, talk to the person near you. What do you think of, how would you define anti-racism? So with that in mind, which definition best matches yours? So consider the 4 definitions up here. Which definition of anti-racism best matches yours? A, not being racist. B, staying clear of any conversations about race. C, actively promoting racial equity. Or D, rejecting supremacy of one racial group over another. And then just quickly check in with your partner. What do you think, A, B, C, or D? My folks participating online, there's an option to participate via Pear Deck or via the chat. Promoting racial equity, coming in from folks online. Yeah. So it seems like from conversations, people are leaning towards C and D. Okay. So looking at an anti-racist classroom, anti-racist teaching looks like the normalization of failure. Like breaking this idea that you have to get it right the first time, right? Ken Shelton named perfectionism as a condition of white supremacy, right? And in order to break that conditioning of you must get it right the first time, we need to normalize failure as part of the learning process. It also looks like teaching students in the way that they learn best, using culturally sustaining evidence-based best practices. And that also means asking students how they learn best. What helps them learn best? Because if you're not asking, you're just committing a suicide. It also means interrupting and speaking up against racism and standing up for equity, right? We typically think of like the extremes, hate crimes, burning crosses, but then it actually shows up in more subtle and insidious ways, microaggressions, or even in our instructional materials, right? So we've got instructional materials that say the Atlantic slave trade between the 1500s and 1800s brought millions of workers from Africa to the southern United States to work on agricultural plantations. Talk about whitewashing history. From the United States, from a major publisher. Within the last 10 years? Yeah. And then we also see things like this. What do you notice? What's the impact? This is an actual Dove commercial. This was a video commercial. And these are stills from that commercial. take a moment to pick that apart. Going from, you can take it from going from dirty to clean. What does clean look like? This is real. This is from a real commercial from Dove. And this one's recent, within the last like 5 to 7 years. Yeah. Right? And then it also, yeah. They got called out on it, yeah. There's, yeah. Yep. Yeah, so Dove was a repeat offender on that. I can't pronounce the other one, but the Nivea. Yeah. Nivea has an awful one for men too. I have that images of that in another slide deck. But then it also shows up in our instructional materials. What do you see here? This is from science materials that are NGSS aligned. We have a female in science, yay. She's white. We have a gentleman here, light-skinned. In the video, it shows that he is he's Latino, and that he does speak with an accent. However, light-skinned Latino. What does that say about who gets to do science? And then there's also bias. Focus on diversity and cultural differences in response to pain. This was in a modern nursing textbook. This also made the news, right? Well-intentioned racism. They wanted to highlight cultures, but also created a whole bunch of bias and also created a whole bunch of stereotypes around these. And then it also happens in the classroom too. What's the intention of this? And then what's the impact? Imagine you're a student who is an emerging multilingual, have not yet mastered the academic talk, feel comfortable in social talk, but now you walk into a classroom where this is up on the wall. Right? I saw this as a best practice on Twitter. Right? So looking at social justice, right, it refers to the fair division of resources, opportunities, and privileges in society, such as human rights, income, healthcare, and education. And in science, we've got a whole bunch of issues that we never talk about, or few teachers rarely talk about. Many of our science heroes, like Lamarck and Watson and Crick. Watson is a raging racist. He actually had his Nobel Prize award revoked because he was using his research on DNA to prove eugenics and racial superiority of white folks. We've also seen things like forced sterilization and chemical warfare. Anatomy has a really shady past. Murdering and grave robbing. Then we get into medical apartheid like Henrietta Lacks, the Tuskegee STD experiments, which I recently learned had an associated experiment happening in South America. Prison experimentation. As recent as the last 2 years, Arkansas was testing ivermectin on prisoners without them knowing. They were being told that they were given vitamins to help protect from COVID, when in reality they were being given ivermectin without knowledge or consent. Arkansas, within the last 2 years. Health outcomes and disparities. That the pulse ox sensors The more melanin you have in your skin, the less accurate they are, because it relies on infrared. The more melanin, the more infrared gets blocked, the less accurate it is. Problematic and leads to healthcare disparities, particularly around COVID-19, when they were using pulse ox to monitor how severe COVID is. And we know that there was a disproportional number of deaths with COVID, predominantly affecting Black and brown communities, our communities of color. Then we get into our environmental racism, which then also connects to poverty. And you can't talk about poverty without talking about race, right? Any of the contaminated water crises throughout our country. Chromium-6, air pollution and asthma. So looking at, even here in the Bay Area, Richmond and the refineries and who lives near those refineries. Urban heat islands, we've got a huge problem with this right here in San Jose. Deforestation, water rights. So Linda Darling-Hammond, I think, sums it up accurately. Some children come to school every day and have their cultures validated, and other children have theirs invalidated, even berated daily. So take a deep breath. Check in on that compass. Where are you? Just quick personal check. Have you shifted? Maybe why you've shifted. Also take a deep breath. Because I saw some people's faces, some of the wow moments. Yeah. All right, conditions of an anti-racist classroom. Looking at science in general, our expectations of who can participate in STEM creates an environment where students constantly have to ask the question, do I belong here? This comes from Brian Brown. He is an educator and STEM enthusiast and advocate. He has a great video of science in the city. I'm going to play a short video of a classroom. And then I want you to identify, what do you notice and what conditions need to exist that allow for this level of dialogue?
All right, let's put it up. If you think that the connection, the fields that Maribel and Garvey talking about, if you think that's related to the force, positive vibrations, you're going to do a thumbs up. If you think it's probably not related to the force, you're going to do a thumbs down. You can do somewhere in the middle. What are you thinking?
Like this around.
Do you think what do we mean by force?
What do you mean by the field?
And what do you mean by the fields? We got to see more about that. What do we mean?
I guess like around it, or like particular space to it. Yeah. So it's around like where it can hit. Like the middle. The force or the magnets create the shock, because it couldn't be like right directly on the coil.
Couldn't be directly on the coil. It's not touching.
No.
So maybe there's some space in between. Have you ever noticed a field when dealing with magnet or electricity? Have you ever noticed not quite touching something, but feeling the effect of electricity or magnetism?
When you, I don't know if y'all tried it, but when you flip one and you can't really put them together and you try, you can feel it like slip off.
Give me a thumbs up if you try that. Having magnets and turning one around the other way. You can't push them together.
Yeah, I tried that. Do this and they'll like push away. You don't even have to touch them, you just do it.
And so is that what you guys are talking about when you say the field? So there's something that's going on in the space between, but you can't see. And that's what you mean by field. What do you think?
I don't think if that was true, wouldn't it pull away from the coil?
So, okay, so you're saying, so maybe that's push it the opposite way. So you're saying that
and bring you back to the question of what conditions need to exist for this level of dialogue to happen? What are some ideas? The freedom to not know, to question, trust, relationships, community. Notice how they were sitting. Yeah. They're sitting on top of the desk. Some of them are kind of like, kneeling on the seat. So they're comfy, right? Whatever sense of comfy they have. Yeah. There were no raising of hands, right? It dismantled some of those systems that we typically see in a classroom of control and of power. They're not in rows. They're in a circle. They don't have to raise hands. Some of them are talking to each other. Nobody got in trouble for what's typically seen as an outburst, right? And so we need to start examining classrooms, right? And looking at our own structures at our school sites, in our context, about who's engaged or excluded from classroom activities. And this takes some really deep reflection. And it can be hard, and it can be a gut punch as you're engaging in these reflective questions. Who's treated as a knower in the classroom, right? Looking at that classroom video, the students were responding to each other, and they were treated as the knowers. And they had other ways of knowing, and they talked about other experiences that they've had with magnets and playing with magnets. And again, it goes back to that practicing of science as a community. So those conditions, I worked with a number of educators, science educators, and we sat around brainstorming, diverse group of folks. And we came up with these 5 conditions, talking about classroom culture, the pedagogical decisions, culturally sustaining, classroom discourse, and of course, on the foundation of self-reflection. And so there's some questions under each of the aspects, but starting that work from inside out, right? We have to critically examine our practices, our thoughts, our behaviors, our choices, and our attitudes. There are some reflective questions there for you and some resources. Implicit bias test on Harvard. Encourage you to take a few. We all have implicit biases based on the world we live in, right? We live in a patriarchal society. That means there's some bias around that. Yeah. Classroom culture. Yeah. It's code switching, right? It's that idea of having to code switch and recognizing that they have to code switch, right? It's kind of the yes and. Like, yes, your culture is just get in there, right? I grew up in New Jersey, so the Jersey accent comes out every once in a while. I lost most of it because of an experience I had in college. But I grew up being friends with lots of Italian families. And their family gatherings were large and loud, and everybody's like in there, and you knew somebody was into the conversation if they were talking. They were talking over each other, but it wasn't disrespectful, right? So and the same thing. Like, I had one student who, like, that was the only way he could get a word in edgewise in his family, was just like, hey, yo, like, I'm gonna talk over because that's what's going on here, and that's what I'm used to, and that's how I'm used to being heard. And how many times do we see enthusiasm getting shot down as not being compliant or being disruptive, right? So how do we also help educators and gently start pushing back on those expectations and those norms? And even just being clear with educators, like, hey, this is how things work here. And I'm trying to help prepare them, but understand that this is not coming up from a place of wanting to disrupt. This is a place from showing engagement, right? And that gets into that classroom culture. What does the messaging say about diversity relationships without even saying a word, right? Who, again, goes back to that, who's the keeper of the knowledge? Is it the teacher? or is it a community? And that also gets into like questioning roles. Like how do you see your role as an educator? And sometimes having tough conversations if you're in a leadership role about that. And then also that follows closely with discourse, right? What language is accepted? Going back to that unintentional racism, right? The diverse languages. Does it need to be a complete thought? It does, and whether or not students feel comfortable and safe in expressing in their own language, in a kind of broken set of ideas, because we tend to think about most classrooms as being very formal. But educating and learning, you have to play with the ideas. You have to be able to talk about them. And that goes into some of our decisions that we make within the classroom. So the content, the materials, the strategies being used, and then also that aspect of culturally sustaining, so leveraging students' assets. And I recently grappled with switching from culturally relevant to culturally sustaining or culturally responsive. And I like to think about it in terms of plants. I have a black thumb, and usually I'm responding to the plants. It's usually, oh crud, that plant is wilting, here's some water, and then I forget about it again. That's kind of the equivalent of culturally responsive. Oh, that student's withering. Let me respond in a cultural way, and then go back to whatever I was doing before. Whereas culturally sustaining, there's that nurturing element to it. So constantly tending, constantly checking in, constantly seeing and adjusting to help that student thrive all along. And that gets into also what beliefs are present and perpetuated about race and cultures in your content area. All right. Let's see. There's a whole section on responding, but I do want to point out some, yeah, I know I've got 1 more minute left. Wrapping up really quickly that language is power, life, and the instrument of culture, and the instrument of domination and liberation, right? So how we use words has power. Are we using words to help or to hurt? And sometimes that intention doesn't equal the impact. So, yeah, we're the adults in the room. Our responsibility to enact change as the adults, and even push back on within our own system, right? So that intervening, minimizing harm, increasing allyship, and even using teachable moments, not only with students, but with our peers. There's some resources in there for you about the 3 Ps of interrupting racist things. There's also a great article about reframing language used about non-dominant groups, those kids, that student. I've heard it before. And usually my response is, what do you mean? Tell me about that more. Who do you mean by those students? And sometimes it makes them squirm. That's okay. Another offering, there's a single point rubric for reflection. So if you are the self-reflective type, this goes back to those 5 things. There's a little point for each of them. The link in there is it makes a copy. There's a link for feedback. Please, please, please leave me some feedback. I'm always looking to learn and grow. And I know I'm completely out of time, but I have some favorite books. And my parting thought for you all is do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. Thank you.